Hi, these are the most interesting historical photos that I could find. Here we go. They reached New York in 1955, 10 years after Hiroshima. 25 young survivors came hoping American surgeons could rebuild their faces. Near Vitebsk in 1942, German troops forced Soviet women to walk ahead on a mined road. The photo was taken from a German tank with armed local police visible beside them. In 1975, a tourist raft test below Niagara Falls turned into disaster within seconds. 29 people were thrown into the river and 3 never made it back. In Chinese Turkestan around 1913, this man is trapped in a cangue, a heavy wooden collar used as public punishment. The board was so large he could barely sleep or feed himself without help from strangers. For 11 hours in 1938, John William Ward stood on a 17th floor ledge above Manhattan. A traffic policeman posing as a hotel worker kept him talking with water, cigarettes, and small talk until the long standoff finally ended. This is the armored glass from a Messerschmitt Bf-109 cockpit. It was thick enough to stop deadly fragments and give pilots a real chance to survive air combat. Norderney Beach in the 1890s looks packed with wicker chairs, long dresses, and tiny sailboats on the shore. These hooded beach chairs became a famous German seaside symbol, built to block wind, sun, and staring eyes. Near Truk in 1944, Burns and Gill waited on their crippled Kingfisher after pulling survivors from the sea. Once everyone was clear, a United States submarine sank the plane. The Moby Prince burned in Livorno Harbor in 1991 after a collision that became Italy's deadliest merchant ship disaster since the war. 140 people died, and the case still raises questions in Italy today. After the Soviet collapse, Ukraine gave up the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal. In return, it received security assurances on paper, a promise that would be tested years later. At Arras and Bullecourt in 1917, German soldiers climbed from a shattered trench with their hands raised before British troops. The ground is so torn apart, it looks almost empty of life. This 19th century Chinese cangue turned punishment into public helplessness. The prisoner could not even reach his own mouth, so survival depended on strangers. In 1926, Sweden saw its first car bomb when dynamite tore through this taxi and killed 16 Flyborg at once. The 2 men behind it were sentenced to life, then later pardoned. In 1947, 4 men test the strange 3-wheeled Davis car on a Los Angeles street. The company collapsed fast, and its founder soon went to prison for fraud. Over the Gulf of Tonkin in 1965, Lieutenant Jack Terhune ejects from his stricken Crusader as another jet flies beside him. He was pulled from the sea by an American rescue helicopter. In Paris in 1950, wounded veterans of the First World War filled the street in a mass parade of hand-powered tricycles. Decades after the fighting ended, the war was still rolling through the city. On Iwo Jima in 1954, Japanese crews cut apart a warship that had nearly vanished under the sand. 9 years after the battle, the island was still giving the war back piece by piece. In a Beijing prison around 1917, inmates sit in rows making matchboxes under guard. Even the smallest box in the room came from prison labor. In New Guinea in 1942, an American tanker does laundry in a washing machine built from a steel drum. Even in a war zone, soldiers still had to invent ways to clean their clothes. In Spain in 1968, workers protested Franco's strike ban by spending lunch break standing silently against a wall. It was a protest with no signs, no chants, and no safe room to hide in. In Belarus in 1943, partisans crawl under a wooden bridge to set the charge. One quiet blast here could stop an entire enemy column. In New York in 1890, women lay packed inside the holding cell at the Eldridge Street Station House. Jacob Riis used photos like this to expose how the city hid misery behind police walls. Suspects in the Charles King Solomon case sit inside a police van after the Boston underworld boss was shot in 1933. Solomon controlled bootlegging, drugs, and gambling, making his fall one of the city's biggest gangland shocks. At El Alamein in 1942, a British troop truck vanishes in a mine blast in front of the men behind it. One hidden charge could erase a vehicle in a single second. In 1936, Crossley built a radio so huge it looked like a wall of tubes and speakers. It cost more than a new Ford and pushed sound through 6 speakers with 75 watts of power. The Great Blondin crossed Niagara on a tightrope in 1859 and kept making it harder each time. He carried a man on his back, pushed a wheelbarrow, and even stopped on the rope to cook an omelet. In 1928, Jean Lussier rode over Niagara Falls inside a giant rubber ball filled with air tanks. About 150,000 people watched as he became the first person to make the drop without a barrel. In Upper Volta in 1968, young mechanic Habib built his own open-top car from a Citroën 2CV. He drove it in the Independence Day parade, turning scrap and skill into a showpiece. In 1934, San Francisco police waited for strike unrest, wearing gas masks and carrying tear gas guns. The city looked one spark away from chaos. In 1946, Merle Larson climbed out onto his Piper Cub in midair to hand-start the dead engine. It worked, and he flew the plane back down safely. In Vienna in March 1938, Jewish residents were forced to scrub Austria from the street after the annexation. The humiliation was public by design, with crowds watching as power turned people into a warning. Near Vyborg in 1940, a Soviet soldier fires from the snow behind a ski-mounted steel shield. The shield was 8 millimeters thick and could stop a standard rifle bullet even from 200 meters. After a B-17 returned in 1944, ground crews stripped out a mountain of spent machine gun cases. A fully armed B-17E could carry about 4,800 rounds. In Hamburg in 1952, a man stands with a sign that says he is ready for any work. Post-war Germany was rebuilding, but for many people, survival still meant waiting in public to be chosen. In Brooklyn in July 1931, a derailed streetcar smashed straight into a corner drugstore. One bad turn on the tracks turned a normal city block into a crash scene. Near the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen in 1945, American troops captured a German frogman pulled from the Rhine after a failed sabotage mission. The river was freezing, and the attack collapsed before the divers could reach the bridge. In February 1943, this United States Navy Martin PBM lies broken in Willoughby Bay after crashing just after takeoff from Norfolk. All 7 crewmen aboard were lost. In Copenhagen in 1945, Danish resistance fighters seized 2 German soldiers as open fighting spreads into the city streets. After years in the shadows, the resistance was suddenly acting in full daylight. At Fire Support Base Ripcord in 1970, a United States officer checks the mortar line within seconds of impact. The faster he reads the angle, the faster return fire can begin. In Russia in 1885, craftsmen in Kronstadt shaped diving helmets by hand. Europe's first diving school made the city a place where even foreign divers wanted to train. In London in December 1928, Christmas mail buried the station platform under sacks. Holiday cheer for the city meant chaos for the men sorting it. In England in 1942, a WAF recruit demonstrates a hard self-defense hold during police training. These women trained like men, learning how to restrain suspects as part of wartime duty. In Leningrad in 1950, workers carved out the giant escalator tunnel for Technological Institute Station. The hole looks less like a subway and more like the mouth of a buried steel machine. At Wounded Knee in 1973, an American Indian Movement member stands guard as captives line the roadside. The standoff turned a place of old memory into a new national crisis. In Berlin in April 1945, Red Army crews load Katyusha rockets for the final battle. One truck could send a whole wave of rockets screaming into the city in seconds. In Berlin in May 1945, people clear streets through blocks torn open by the last battle. Even after the fighting stopped, the city looked like a broken shell. Stalingrad looked almost erased in the summer of 1943, even 6 months after the fighting ended. This Po-2 view also catches a railway bridge in the distance, one of the few clear lines still cutting through the wrecked city. Berlin was flooded with visitors during the 1936 Olympics, while Nazi symbols covered the streets from end to end. Germany also used one of the first live television broadcasts of the Games to show the world its power and wealth. The stern guns of the battleship Mutsu rose from Hiroshima Bay in July 1970, nearly 27 years after the ship was lost in a sudden internal blast. Japan had already pulled 580 tons of fuel from the wreck in 1944. In 1908, Julius Neubronner proved pigeons could carry tiny cameras after one of his birds vanished for 4 days and came back well fed. His flying photos became a sensation, and some were even developed on the spot and sold as postcards. New Year gift parcels for Soviet frontline soldiers were being prepared in December 1942, with workers writing each crate by hand. Even in one of the hardest years of the war, factories still turned holiday packages into a direct link between home. A prosthetic maker in Vietnam adjusts artificial limbs in 1980, surrounded by rows of devices waiting for new owners. Philip Jones Griffiths captured a quiet room where survival, repair, and patience were built by hand. A veiled woman from Samarkand stands beside a rough wooden door around 1910 in one of Sergei Prokudin-Gorsky's early color photographs. Hunters in Aceh, Sumatra, posed with a Malayan tapir in 1899 when the animal still lived across much of Southeast Asia. The Malayan tapir is the largest tapir species on Earth. The Sutherland sisters turned their floor-length hair into a sensation after growing up in deep poverty on a turkey farm near New York. By the 1880s, their hair measured up to over 2 meters and helped launch one of the most famous hair tonics of the age. Bobby Saul was thrown onto the sand at Daytona Beach in March 1936, while his racing car flipped 3 times during a practice run. He was knocked unconscious, but survived a crash that looked far worse than it ended. This crossing on the Volga was hit during the battle for Stalingrad in August 1942, when German dive bombers kept striking the river route. Many ferries were destroyed in those days, turning every trip across the water into a desperate race to survive. This is not a wartime photograph, but a screenshot from the game Il-2 Sturmovik, Battle of Stalingrad, made to look like a battered 1943 attack plane limping home. The real Il-2 was famous for taking extreme damage and still returning. A Soviet soldier grabs a bicycle from a German woman in Berlin in 1945, in one of the most tense street scenes of the occupation. Soviet soldiers entered German villages in East Prussia in October 1944, bringing the war onto German soil for the first time. That advance marked a turning point because the front was no longer only moving west, but into the heart of the Reich. Captured boys from the Hitler Youth and Volkssturm stand at the front of a prisoner column in Berlin in May 1945. The last reserve of Nazi Germany had become school-age fighters by the final collapse. Moscow police processed detainees under emergency rule on October 6, 1993, after the attack on the White House. Boris Yeltsin had imposed a curfew, and being outside after 8 in the evening was banned. Penal labor convicts on Sakhalin were photographed in 1891, wearing heavy restraints built to slow every step. These images came from one of the harshest exile systems in the Russian Empire. German soldiers arrested on suspicion of desertion stand with their hands raised behind the Western Front in 1944. By the final year of the war, Nazi Germany was hunting its own men as the army began to crack from within. Afghan fighters in 1979 are pictured with Soviet weapons like the PPSH and the Mosin rifle. These older guns stayed popular because they were simple, tough, and easy to keep working in harsh conditions. An American woman bakes bread in an outdoor adobe oven on a Hispano farm near Taos in 1939. In rural New Mexico, this old method survived into the modern age because Horno ovens held heat for hours and fed whole families at once. Japanese men detained in New York during a police raid on March 2, 1942, sit crowded inside a police vehicle. Investigators said some had not registered under the Enemy Alien Act. Lord Curzon and his wife Mary rode the elephant Lakshman Prasad in Delhi in 1902, turning imperial ceremony into a display of power and spectacle. North Korean soldiers in Pyongyang on October 21, 1950, raised a hand-drawn South Korean flag and begged to be spared. The paper flag turned to surrender into one of the starkest images of the Korean War. Volcanologist Arpad Kerner and his assistant stood beside Stromboli in protective suits in 1933, while Kerner was also lowered by rope over the active crater. Stromboli erupts so often that sailors long called it the lighthouse of the Mediterranean. In 1982, Joseph Beuys dumped 7,000 basalt blocks in Kassel and said each one could leave only after one oak was planted. 5 years later, the city had 7,000 new trees. Paul Hawkins flew off the Monaco circuit and into the harbor in 1965, yet still escaped from his sunken Lotus alive. This photo shows his car being lifted from the water after one of Formula One's most surreal crashes. Soviet soldiers checked their gear before the moon-sunned landing in September 1944. This assault helped cut off German forces in the Baltic and push the front closer to East Prussia. A South Vietnamese battalion commander threatens a captured North Vietnamese soldier in the Mekong Delta in 1965. The photo freezes the war at its rawest, when fear, power, and survival collided face to face. An infamous boarding house owner stands in 1921 after being tied to the poisoning deaths of 7 travelers. The photo feels even colder because her crimes were driven by robbery, not rage. Linda Nicole trained with Mr. Jamaica 1963, Herbert Dennis in England in 1963. The photo catches the moment strength training was becoming stylish, public, and impossible to ignore. A rescuer searches the flooded Big Thompson River in Colorado after the 1976 flash flood ripped away part of Highway 34. In just a few hours, the small mountain river turned into a wall of water that killed 143 people. A Persian family posed for Anton Sevrugin around 1900, with the man holding an engraved copper lantern for walking at night. Sevrugin's studio became one of the most important visual records of Qajar Persia. Beggars lined the road to a temple in China between 1917 and 1919, waiting where worshippers had to pass. Sidney David Gamble's camera caught poverty not at the edge of the city, but in full public view. Workers lined up for payday at the levee in New Orleans in 1906, standing on boards above deep mud beside horse carts and freight sheds. The scene shows how big public works still ran on cash, crowds, and muscle at the start of the 20th century. An armored car rolled through Vienna on July 27, 1934, as Austria braced for unrest during the failed Nazi putsch. The streets had turned so tense that even the capital needed war-ready patrols. West African Frontier Force soldiers carried away Italian border markers on the Kenya and Italian Somaliland frontier in 1941. A border can look permanent on a map, but in war, even the signs themselves could vanish in a single march. Soviet soldiers mined a railway west of Moscow on December 1, 1941, as German forces pressed toward the capital. Even a simple knife in the snow became a tool for turning the tracks into a trap. Port Chicago was left in ruins after the 1944 ammunition explosion that tore apart ships, pier, and town in seconds. The blast killed 320 people and exposed the deadly speed over safety culture forced on black sailors. Wojtek Tuka led wartime Slovakia from 1939 to 1944 as the head of a state created under German control. He later sent Slovak divisions to the Eastern Front at Hitler's demand. Soviet mechanics repair the engine of an IS-2 heavy tank in 1944, keeping one of the Red Army's most powerful breakthrough tanks in action. The IS-2 carried a huge 122mm gun that could smash bunkers. A Brest fortress defender returned to the ruins in 1961, 20 years after the siege that made the site a Soviet symbol of resistance. The man on crutches was Vladimir Fursov, who survived the battle and later became a biology professor in Alma-Ata. Lottery tickets were sold in Petrograd in 1921 to raise money for disabled people just before the October holiday. The giant prize on the poster shows how wild post-Civil War Russia had become when public charity and huge sums filled the same street. British soldiers and Irish children faced each other during Belfast unrest in 1972, then turned the standoff into a sudden water fight. Philip Jones Griffiths caught a rare moment when a hard street briefly looked almost playful. Women held behind bars in a United States police station in 1931 after arrests for petty theft during the Great Depression. The photo shows how poverty was filling jail cells when even small survival crimes became common. Prisoners at Flossenburg concentration camp waited for food in 1942 after forced labor in the quarry. The striped uniforms and metal bowls show how hunger was built into camp life. Arrested Soviet civilians sit under guard after being accused of helping partisans or hiding soldiers behind the front. The photo is chilling because the armed escort and waiting firing squad make clear that their fate was already being decided. Iranian motorcycle teams hunted Iraqi armor in the 1980s by using speed, surprise, and a passenger armed with a rocket launcher. The scene looks almost unreal, but these fast hit and run units could appear out of nowhere. Workers load rocket artillery warheads made at a Moscow factory in May and June 1942. Even far from the front, the war moved by hand from factory floor to freight car. Arrested opponents of Nazism stand with their hands up in a basement SA prison in Berlin on March 10, 1933. Just days after Hitler secured power, terror was already moving from the streets into hidden rooms. A passenger train slammed into a work train near Wheaton, Lancashire on July 16, 1961, leaving carriages piled almost upright in a twisted wreck. The crash killed 7 people. Experts sorted Romanov and Yusupov jewels in Moscow in 1925, pulling gemstones from their settings for sale abroad. The treasure of the fallen empire was being stripped apart piece by piece to bring hard currency into the Soviet state. Street sellers lined Ludgate Hill in London in 1907, hauling Christmas gifts into the city by bicycle, cart, and horse wagon. Only 22 years after the first gasoline car, central London still moved to the rhythm of hooves. Protesters packed the streets outside the United States Naval Base at Sasebo on November 12, 1964, fighting against the arrival of an American nuclear submarine. Maria Spiridonova arrived at the Fifth All-Russian Congress in 1918 as one of the most famous leaders of the left socialist revolutionaries. She had already spent years in prison, exile, and hard labor before the revolution turned her into a national figure. Red Army soldiers practiced bayonet fighting in May 1941, just weeks before the German invasion changed everything. Margaret Bourke White captured a moment when training still looked like preparation, not survival. Lieutenant Walter Osipov was dragged out of a transport plane by his own parachute in May 1941 and hung behind it for 33 minutes. He survived only because 2 men in an open biplane flew close enough to grab him out of the air. The Wall Street bomb blast ripped through the street outside the J.P. Morgan Bank at noon on September 16, 1920, turning the financial heart of New York into wreckage. The killer was never found. A float plane from the battleship Valiant made the only successful deck landing of its kind in 1940 after missing its ship during the Mers El Kabir operation. Pilot John Edward Breeze had no way to be picked up from the sea. A Japanese-American soldier stands with his mother in a California strawberry field on May 11, 1942, just before her forced removal to an internment camp. A helicopter lifts a wounded American soldier through the air during Operation Silver City in Vietnam in 1966. The stretcher hangs exposed beneath the aircraft, turning rescue into one of the war's most nerve-tight sights. Wood gas vehicles used onboard gas generators to turn wood or coal into fuel when gasoline was scarce or expensive. This strange technology put fire on buses, cars, and motorcycles, turning ordinary transport into rolling furnaces. A full battalion of Scottish riflemen marched out from Edinburgh in August 1914, then only a tiny line returned by Christmas. The two photos crush the scale of First World War losses into one brutal before and after. Tea porters in Kushan, China, carried loads so huge they almost swallowed the men beneath them between 1917 and 1919. Sidney Gamble caught a world where human backs still did the work of freight animals. Women in London marched for the right to vote in 1900, carrying banners that demanded political power, not patience. What began as street protest would grow into a movement strong enough to break one of Britain's oldest barriers. Italian Arditi trench raiders trained to hit fast and up close in the final year of the First World War. Their short trench knives and shock tactics made them some of Italy's most feared assault troops. Italian planes dropped sheep by parachute over Ethiopia in 1935 to feed troops in the Danakil Desert. Few war images look stranger than livestock falling from the sky just to keep an airborne force alive. Leningrad, after a German air raid in November 1941, looks almost emptied of life, with whole corners torn open. In the first winter of the siege, even central streets could turn into silent ruins overnight. Soviet sappers searched the Weiss-Manfred factory in Budapest with mine detection dogs after the battle in February 1945. In ruined industrial zones, a dog's nose could find what human eyes would miss. Two patrols faced each other across the East and West German border on June 16, 1964, with barbed wire and concrete turning a line on the map into a hard wall. One quiet meeting like this captured the full tension of Cold War Europe. President Gerald Ford was handed a bicentennial rifle in North Carolina on March 13, 1976, by a descendant of Daniel Boone. The gift tied the American Revolution directly to the 200th anniversary year. A heavy Austro-Hungarian motor battery crawls through the mud in 1915 with its gun wrapped against the weather. The photo shows how even early motorized warfare still moved like the old world, slow, filthy, and brutal. Prince Albert, the future George VI, left the Bryant and May factory in March 1926 during a public visit as head of the Industrial Welfare Society. Grenadiers of the Littorio Division moved through snow on the Italian-French border in the winter of 1944 to 1945. Even in the last months of the war, soldiers were still dragging weapons and ammunition across frozen mountain ground. An Italian immigrant family reaches the United States in the 1910s carrying a child and a single bundle of belongings. More than 4 million Italians moved to America in that era, many arriving with almost everything they owned in hand. The Yuri Gagarin Youth Center in Chisinau was a Soviet-era space for children's clubs, events, and public activities. Buildings like this were meant to shape daily life from an early age, with culture, study, and loyalty to the system all under one roof. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is seen in 1940 during his campaign for a third term, a move no United States president had ever won before. Just months later, he would lead the country through World War II. The Turk test lit up the Nevada sky before sunrise on March 7, 1955, from a 150-meter tower. Around 500 soldiers watched from trenches about 5 kilometers away as the blast rose into a giant cloud. An Italian soldier gives water to a child during the Abyssinian campaign in 1936. The war helped Italy take Ethiopia for a short time, but it also exposed one of the clearest colonial invasions of that decade. Men of the Sherwood Foresters march along the Amiens to St. Quentin Road in March 1917 through a landscape stripped bare by war. Photos like this show how whole armies moved on foot through ruined ground on the Western Front. While we're looking at these photos, be sure to write in the comments which pictures you like the most and why. It will be very interesting for me to read your opinion, and we will continue. Stela Cay at Quirigua was already more than 12 centuries old when this jungle photo was taken in Guatemala in the late 1800s. The monument was carved by the ancient Maya with such detail that even beside a full-grown man, it still looks almost unreal. Mexico announces the nationalization of its oil industry in 1938, taking control from foreign companies in one of the boldest moves in its modern history. Sahrawi women of the Polisario Front pose in Western Sahara in May 1976, during the fight that followed Spain's withdrawal from the territory. This photo shows a Joseon-era general's outfit recorded in Korea during the Japanese colonial period, when many older traditions were being documented before they faded. The armor, helmet, and layered robe reflect a military style shaped by ceremony as much as battle. Glenda Farrell arrives at the Carthay Circle Theater in Los Angeles for the premiere of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs on December 21, 1937. That night marked the debut of Disney's first full-length animated feature. Martin Luther King Jr. visits Ernest Green in Little Rock in May 1958, shortly before Green became the first black student to graduate from Little Rock Central High School. A German officer sits beside an unexploded British shell during the Battle of Loos in 1915. On the Western Front, so many shells failed that duds often stayed in the ground long after the fighting moved on. Bevan boys descend into Markham Colliery in Yorkshire in 1943 after being sent to the mines instead of the army. Nearly 48,000 young British men were drafted into coal work during the war to keep the country powered. This wrecked Brinks armored car in Pittsburgh marks the first known commercial armored car holdup in the United States on March 11, 1927. The attack showed that even the heaviest cash trucks were no longer untouchable. A mother and her son sit in shock in Moscow after learning that 4 family members were lost in an air raid in 1941. Margaret Bourke White captured rare scenes like this as the only foreign photographer in the city when the German invasion began. A Soviet field medic helps a wounded Red Army soldier under fire in 1942. This frame came from Day of War, when 160 Soviet cameramen filmed the same day across the front and rear. Hans Conrad Schumann ran toward the wire on August 15, 1961, then crossed from East Berlin to the west in just 6 seconds. The photo froze one of the first and most famous escapes as the Berlin Wall was only beginning to rise. Lois and Ruth Waddell won a New Orleans oyster-eating contest in 1920 after eating 204 oysters between them. Photos like this turned food contests into public spectacle long before radio and film made fame easy. Firefighters pulled General Konstantin Gartong's car from the Moika River in St. Petersburg on September 27, 1912. Even senior figures of the imperial court were already part of the new and risky age of motor travel. Residents built anti-tank barriers on International Avenue in Leningrad in 1941 as the city rushed to prepare for the siege. Men at New York's Hotel de Gink prepare mulligan stew around 1915 in one of the strangest self-run shelters of its time. Built by homeless people for homeless people, these places offered food, beds, and basic care in exchange for work. Women who whitewashed clay houses wait in a Bucharest market for work in 1928. Their long brushes turned a hard daily trade into one of the clearest street scenes of working-class Romania. A Japanese G-4M Betty bomber falls into the sea in 1942 after being hit by American Wildcat fighters near New Britain. The G-4M was fast and long-ranged, but its light protection made it burn and fall hard when caught. Jürgen Stroop stands with SS troops during the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943, then appears again before his execution years later. His own photo report became key evidence of the Nazi operation and later helped convict him. A huge crowd gathered in New York in early 1917 as bread prices and food costs pushed people into protest. Images like this showed that wartime hardship was hitting American streets too, even if many papers kept them out of sight. A Stockholm exercise machine from 1892 used 180 vibrations a minute to shake the rider's whole body. It was sold as medical fitness and even as a way to stimulate digestion. Ruins of Reims in 1917 show how one of France's great cathedral cities was smashed during the First World War. The city became a global symbol of destruction after repeated shelling left whole streets and landmarks in rubble. Fighters moved through Grozny in January 1996, carrying rockets on a baby stroller toward the front line. The image became one of the starkest symbols of how the Chechen War pulled everyday life and war gear into the same street. A hospital in Leningrad burns after a German air raid on September 19, 1941. The bomb hit a building full of wounded people, turning one strike into one of the city's most harrowing early fire scenes. London shoppers crowd store windows during the Christmas rush in 1910 as signs warn the shop will close at 6 in the evening. Even before modern advertising took over, holiday shopping was already a full street spectacle. HMS Glowworm is seen sinking on April 5, 1940, after running into the far larger Admiral Hipper during Germany's move on Norway. The battle became legendary because Captain Gerard Roop kept attacking against impossible odds. A traffic policewoman directs Berlin street traffic in April 1946 in the Soviet sector of the ruined city. Just 1 year after the war, order was returning even as Berlin still stood among wrecked buildings. 1901 turned Niagara into a stage for women who risked the river in barrels, from Martha Wagenfuhrer to Annie Edson Taylor. Annie survived the full drop at age 63. Bobby Leach sits on the steel barrel he took over Niagara Falls in 1911 and survived after months of recovery. He turned the stunt into fame, but later died from a simple leg injury after slipping on an orange peel. German prisoners in a French camp in Algeria pose with homemade instruments in 1917. Even in captivity during the First World War, music remained one of the few ways men could hold on to routine and morale. George Stathakis sits on the barrel he took over Niagara Falls in 1930, a stunt he hoped would fund his book. He survived the drop, but was trapped under the falls for 22 hours, while Red Hill later rode the same barrel through the rapids and lived. Soviet soldiers moved toward the burning Reichstag in Berlin in 1945 with their flag through smoke and rubble. Within days, the building became the final symbol of Nazi Germany's collapse. Passengers on a Tokyo to Osaka train do station exercises during a 5-minute stop at Hamamatsu on August 27, 1952. The break lasted only 3 minutes. An Aero Films plane ditches into a London boating lake in 1920 after its engine fails. Aero Films had been founded just a year earlier, making this one of the earliest crash scenes from Britain's first aerial photography company. 2 wealthy Egyptian women choose dresses in a French atelier in Cairo in 1905. The photo captures a striking meeting of local elite life and European fashion in colonial-era Egypt. HMS Courageous rolls over and sinks on September 17, 1939, after torpedoes from U-29 hit her. She went down in 15 minutes with 518 men. A mob humiliates Jewish residents in Lviv in late June 1941, just after the German takeover of the city. The photo captures the opening days of a pogrom that began as Nazi occupation and local collaboration merged into public terror. Women work on sword production for the Japanese military in Matsue around 1944 as wartime labor reached deep into civilian life. By the final years of the war, many jobs once done by men had shifted to women as Japan struggled to keep production going. Test pilot Apolinary Tomaszewski's coffin is carried through Moscow in November 1926 on the very aircraft pushed by hand to his grave. Few funeral images feel stranger than this, with a dead aviator making one last journey on his own machine. Pro-communist demonstrators clash with police in central Tokyo on May 1, 1952, just as Japan's occupation era was ending on paper. Captured American and Filipino troops stand at Mariveles in April 1942 after the fall of Bataan. Tens of thousands were taken prisoner there, and many later died from exhaustion, disease, and abuse in captivity. Experts watch light bulbs move down the line at Tokyo Shibara Electric in January 1951 as post-war Japanese industry rapidly modernized. The company later became Toshiba, one of the biggest names in Japan's industrial rise. A person brought to a New York police station in 1890 stands beside the board used to sleep in a station restroom. Jacob Riis photographed scenes like this to show the harsh edges of city poverty and police life. Refugees crowd the roof of a train in Berlin in 1945 as the Third Reich collapsed around them. By the final months of the war, trains like this carried not victory, but escape. Men in Tongchuan cut wood for coffin lids in China between 1917 and 1919. Sidney Gamble's photo captures death work as ordinary street labor, done in the open by hand. Nurses from Japan's new self-defense forces stand at a field medical post on Hokkaido in October 1955 during early post-war maneuvers. Jackie Ickes sits in quiet focus at Zandvoort on June 20, 1971, just before the Dutch Grand Prix. The calm look is striking because by the next day he would win on one of Europe's fastest seaside tracks. The Houndsditch affair turned London upside down in 1910 after a failed jewel robbery left 3 police officers dead and anarchists on the run. The faces in this collage became part of one of Edwardian Britain's biggest manhunts. Churchill peers around the corner during the Sydney Street siege in London in 1911 as police and soldiers surround the gunman. The standoff became one of Britain's most famous early urban shootouts, and Churchill's presence made it even more infamous. S.A. André and his team launched for the North Pole by balloon in 1897, but the flight began going wrong almost at once. The Arctic swallowed the expedition so completely that the men were not found for 33 years. Black students walked to school in Little Rock in 1957, while white classmates glare and mock them in the street. The image captures how school integration in the United States was fought not only in courts, but face-to-face by teenagers. A stone Buddha stands at Kotsugahara in Japan in 1901, on ground once used for public executions. The calm figure and the history of the place create one of those rare photos that feels quiet and unsettling at the same time. Women work on sword production for the Japanese military in Matsue around 1944 as wartime labor reached deep into civilian life. By the final years of the war, many jobs once done by men had shifted to women as Japan struggled to keep production going. Halloween costumes in the United States during the 1920s looked homemade, playful, and strangely uncanny all at once. Long before plastic masks and movie brands, people built these looks from cloth, paper, and pure imagination. Red Army soldiers moved toward a burning house in Stalingrad in 1942 while covering each other under fire. Street fighting there was so close and chaotic that single houses could become battle points for days. A barricade rises in Linz and government artillery fires into city streets during Austria's February uprising in 1934. The clash lasted only days, but it crushed the socialist movement and cleared the way for authoritarian rule. 4 armed women of the Popular Republican Militia Patrol Madrid in 1936 at the start of the Spanish Civil War. In those first months, women openly carried rifles in the streets before many were later pushed out of frontline roles. These paired images show how Mussolini's propaganda machine edited reality in 1942 to make him look like a lone, heroic rider. The original included a handler holding the horse, and removing him turned a managed pose into a myth. Homes burn at the edge of Tulsa's Greenwood district during the massacre of 1921. The attack destroyed one of the most successful black communities in the United States in less than 2 days. A Chinese couple poses before their wedding in 1892 after meeting only minutes earlier. In arranged marriages like this, a lifetime could begin before the bride and groom had barely spoken. Women clearing Leningrad streets stop and look up as an air battle unfolds above the city in the spring of 1943. Even routine labor in besieged Leningrad could turn into a front-row view of war in seconds. Stone Buddhas at Longmen in Qing era. China rise from cliffs carved with thousands of cave shrines. By the late 1800s, this place had already preserved more than 1,000 years of Buddhist art in stone. Lillian LaFrance rides a tiny car on the Wall of Death in the 1920s, becoming the first woman known to pull off that stunt. She turned carnival danger into fame and stayed one of the world's best-known stuntwomen for years. Murray, a house burglar, was photographed on February 1, 1929, after a life of break-ins and fast spending. He never turned crime into wealth because his stolen money vanished into drink and brothels almost as fast as he took it. A man in an Agaba mask stands in Achala, Nigeria, in 1946, wearing a towering costume used in Igbo ritual dance. Masks like this were meant to embody powerful ancestral spirits, giving the performance a presence that felt larger than any one person. Child oyster shuckers work inside an Alabama cannery in February 1911, including 8-year-old girls earning only a few cents for a full day. Photos like this helped expose how deeply child labor was built into American industry. Jews stand in a Wiesbaden synagogue courtyard on August 29, 1942, during registration before deportation to Theresienstadt. The scene looks quiet, but for many people in line, it was the last stop before disappearance. 3 teenagers pose with police after wrecking a stolen car in New York in 1935. The smashed front end shows how joyrides in that era could end in a police photo and a pile of twisted steel. The Peacemaker was tested in New York Harbor in the 1880s as one of America's early submarines. It could dive and carry mines, but weak range and poor control kept it out of the Navy. Shoppers rush into Moscow's central department store in 1989, hoping to grab scarce goods before they vanish. A police officer lunges after a man cutting past the line, capturing the tense daily reality of late Soviet shopping. Sailors scramble off HMS Prince of Wales after Japanese aircraft left the battleship fatally damaged off Malaya on December 10, 1941. The sinking shattered Britain's naval power in Asia in a single morning and showed that even giant warships were no longer safe from air attack. Charleston dancers strike frozen poses outside St. Louis City Hall in 1925 because cameras of that era could not clearly catch such a fast dance in motion. The scene looks wild and spontaneous, but it was carefully staged for the lens. London passengers ride a horse-drawn tram in 1882 when city travel still moved on rails without engines. This quiet street scene shows a machine from the short age between the carriage and the electric tram. Marlene Dietrich sweeps the floor at the Hollywood Canteen, where film stars served food and worked side by side with soldiers during the war. The glamorous screen icon became an American citizen in 1939 and turned her fame into direct support for troops. 2 young men ride a flood like a wave in Mexico in 1967, turning a stranded car into a moving surfboard. The photo feels almost unreal because a dangerous city flood looks like a moment of play. A lone suffragist stands above a sea of men in 1911, demanding equal rights in a world built to silence her. The crowd itself is the story, because almost every face around her belongs to the system she came to confront. Red Army soldiers captured German troops in Berlin in May 1945, including one man wearing a woman's dress in a last desperate disguise. The photo catches the strange final hours of the Third Reich, when collapse turned even surrender into a scene of confusion and fear. Abakovsky's Aero Wagon stands at Moscow's Paveletsky Station in 1921 with a giant aircraft propeller fixed to a rail car like a machine from the future. It could reach about 140 kilometers per hour. Masked female IRA members pose with weapons in Ireland in 1971 during one of the darkest chapters of the Northern Ireland conflict. The image feels chilling because the matching jackets and covered faces make the scene look more like a secret ritual than a street photograph. Wehrmacht troops cross into the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, at the first hours of the invasion that opened the largest front of the war. A propaganda cameraman is already filming beside them. Boston shoplifting suspects stand under the police lineup board in 1934, turning a routine arrest into a stark public record. The empty floor around them makes the photo feel even colder, as if shame itself was part of the punishment. New Red Army recruits from poor peasant families received bread in 1918 as hunger and war shaped the first days of service. The heavy loaves in their arms say more than any speech, because food was as vital to the revolution as rifles. Soviet soldiers cover the Reichstag walls with names and messages in 1945, turning a symbol of Nazi power into a giant victory ledger. These rough signatures became some of the war's most haunting marks, because each line said the same thing: "We reached Berlin." Sergeant Ronald Payne emerges from a Viet Cong tunnel in South Vietnam on January 21, 1967, after entering one of the hidden underground worlds that shaped the war. These tunnel hunters worked in darkness so tight. A former Ravensbrück prisoner shows her scars at the Nuremberg trials in 1946, turning hidden cruelty into evidence before the world. The image is powerful because her body speaks where words could never be enough. German troops prepare to storm a building in Stalingrad in 1942, where every room and staircase could turn into a separate battlefield. The fight for this city lasted more than 5 months and became the moment when Germany's advance in the East began to break. Inside a tiny Atlantic City Nickelodeon in 1922, visitors peek into individual machines to watch short films, cartoons, and hand-colored slides before modern movie theaters took over. To not miss the daily selection of historical photos, subscribe to my channel and write in the comments which photo impressed you most. Thank you for watching.